History is a subject that has rarely been taught to its true, full story. What if I told you that the identity of Native Americans most of you think you know is far from being complete? There was a chapter about dark-skinned Native Americans that was hidden, suppressed, and intentionally wiped away. A people whose legacy intertwines deeply with the ancient root of Black Americans. For many centuries, this truth has been hidden beneath several misrepresentations and silence. The dark-skinned Native Americans were not an exception. They were a significant part of the rich heritage of indigenous cultures across the Americas. Unfortunately, colonialism, systemic racism, and the false stories of history have left these narratives nearly forgotten. Today, the connection between Native Americans and African Americans remains misunderstood or commonly ignored. The story doesn't end there. It's time to expose the shocking truth about the dark-skinned Native Americans, uncovering their origins, their contributions, and how their erasure has influenced and refined the identity of Black Americans in ways you can't even think of. This revelation isn't just one of those stories about the past. It's a revelation that challenges everything we think we know about race, identity, and belonging. Stick around as we uncover the untold history of dark-skinned Native Americans and reveal their undeniable connection to Black Americans. At the end of this journey, you'll never look at history the same way again. Give this video a thumbs up as we begin our journey. When you hear the term Native American, what image comes to mind? For most individuals, it's a narrow and often overused word that portrays plain tribes, feathered headdresses, and lighter skin tones. But this common depiction ignores the wide diversity of indigenous peoples, including those with darker skin tones who were vibrantly doing well across the Americas before European contact. The truth is that Native American cultures were as diverse as the lands they inhabited. Indigenous peoples developed unique ways of life that were influenced by their environments, from the snow-covered tundras of the Arctic to the tropical rainforests of Central America. And among them were dark-skinned tribes that were commonly overlooked, yet contributed significantly to this rich tapestry of civilizations. Some accounts of history and oral traditions from tribes themselves describe darker-skinned people in their communities. These accounts were not only recorded by indigenous peoples, but also by early European explorers who documented their encounters with native tribes whose physical appearances challenged their already existing perception of race and ethnicity. For instance, the Yamasee people of the southeastern United States. Historical records describe members of this tribe as having dark skin, which is a feature that is commonly ignored or downplayed in mainstream narratives. Similar accounts also exist for other tribes, like the Washita, who are perceived to have thrived in the lower Mississippi Valley and have long been celebrated by some historians and researchers as evidence of the diversity among native populations. Additionally, modern sciences have also provided some clues. The study of genetics revealed that the native populations of the Americas were not monolithic. They had a wide array of genetic markers, some of which had dominant traits that were associated with African populations. This diversity aligns with oral histories that speak of migrations, ancient connections, and interactions that occurred long before colonization. Now the question is, why then are these dark-skinned Native Americans rarely acknowledged in historical narratives? The answer lies in the deliberate crafting of history by colonial powers, whose intent was to divide and conquer by imposing rigid racial categories. These categories erased the complexity of indigenous identities and stripped away the visibility of darker-skinned tribes, replacing them with a one-dimensional narrative that had so many untold stories. Having a good understanding of this diversity is crucial for straightening historical inaccuracies, and also for honoring the full spectrum of Native American heritage. Dark-skinned Native Americans were not anomalies. They played a significant role in America's indigenous culture as leaders, warriors, healers, and builders of civilizations. This lays the foundation for the connections between Native Americans and so-called Black Americans, which you call African Americans. To start with, we must first do away with the myths and recognize the true diversity of the people who once called this land home long before its colonization. Their story begins with the acknowledgement of their existence and the unraveling of the history that sought to erase them. When history is observed through an unfiltered lens, it often reveals surprising connections. To uncover this truth, we must travel back thousands of years, several decades before the arrival of European colonizers, to trace the pathways of humanity itself. Let's begin with the cradle of humanity, Africa. Scientists widely agree that all modern humans had their origin in Africa over 200,000 years ago. There was a wave of migration that spread across the globe and influenced the genetic and cultural diversity of the vast human populations. Among these waves were groups of individuals who traveled to the Americas through ancient land bridges and sea routes, carrying with them the seeds of complex societies. One of the most well-known theories of early migration is the Bering Land Bridge, which was a land extension that connected Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age. This route allowed ancient peoples to cross into the Americas and eventually spread across the continents. However, this is only part of the story. Emerging evidence suggests that other less conventional routes may have brought people to the Americas, and these routes are where the connections to dark-skinned Native Americans become even more intriguing. Consider the Olmec civilization, which is one of the earliest advanced societies in Mesoamerica. The Olmecs, who thrived around 1200 BCE, left behind colossal stone heads, of which some display features that many historians and researchers associate with African phenotypes. These artifacts have aroused a serious question. Were these features coincidental, or do they point to ancient transatlantic contact between Africa and the Americas? Individuals who were in support of the transatlantic contact theory argue that ancient Africans possessed the maritime technology to cross the Atlantic. Historical records from ancient Egypt, for instance, describe the use of reed boats that are capable of moving through the open waters. Beyond physical artifacts, several cultural similarities between African and Native American societies hint at possible interactions. Similarities in culture, spiritual practices, agricultural practices, and architectural styles suggest that ideas may have traveled across the Atlantic. For example, both African and pre-Columbian American cultures revered the concept of the world tree, a symbolic connection between the heavens, earth, and the underworld. Scientists have also begun to explore these connections through genetic studies. While the dominant narrative attributes Native American ancestry primarily to East Asian populations, some studies have revealed traces of genetic markers typically associated with African lineage. These findings, though controversial, open the door to re-examining long-held assumptions about the people of the Americas. Anthropological evidence further complicates the narrative. In Brazil, the discovery of a 12,000-year-old skeleton named Lucia challenged the traditional perception of Native American ancestry. Lucia's skull had several features that are commonly found in the African population. This suggests that early migrations to the Americas may have been far more diverse than we may have previously believed. Trade networks also played a significant role in promoting connections between distant civilizations. Although the transatlantic trade of the colonial era is usually related to exploitation and slavery, ancient trade routes likely promoted cultural exchanges long before. Some historians argue that seafaring Africans could have introduced goods, technologies, and ideas to the Americas, which contributed to the rich diversity of the pre-Columbian societies. These connections were not limited to material goods. African and Native American languages had vocal similarities. Certain words and phonetic patterns that were found in the languages of West African tribes and indigenous Caribbean peoples had striking similarities. Such linguistic ties may be a subtle yet profound reminder of ancient relationships. Even within the Native American communities, the diversity of physical appearances tells a story of complexity within its origins. From the darker-skinned populations of the Caribbean to the indigenous peoples of the southeastern United States, their features were a display of a blend between ancient migrations, environmental adaptations, and intermingling with other groups. Oral tradition that was passed down through generations also supports the existence of ancient connections. Stories of visitors from across the sea, bearing gifts and new knowledge, are common in the lore of many indigenous tribes. These narratives, often dismissed by Western historians, may hold stories of truth about forgotten chapters in human history. Despite the clear evidence, the idea of ancient African connections to the Americas remains a controversial topic. Mainstream academia often gives blind eyes to theories that challenge these already established narratives. However, as discoveries emerge and old biases are being questioned, the possibility of such connections gains more credibility. The evidence linking dark-skinned Native Americans to ancient migrations and possible African contact brings us to rethink what we know about the past. These connections are not just historical footnotes, but are vital pieces of a larger puzzle that reveals the true identity of the Americas and its people. With the arrival of European colonizers in the Americas, the lives and histories of Native peoples were changed forever. For dark-skinned Native Americans, the colonization era marked the beginning of an intentional act to wipe their presence and suppress their identities. This erasure was not a coincidence, but a deliberate, systematic, and deeply rooted in the colonizers' ideology of racial hierarchy and control. Colonial powers approached the Americas with one primary objective: to claim land, resources, and dominance. They needed to dismantle indigenous societies and impose their structures for them to achieve this. At the center of this strategy was the creation of racial categories that were designed to divide and conquer. These categories, black, white, and native, were strictly implemented, leaving no room for the complexities of identity that existed in pre-colonial societies. Dark-skinned Native Americans who didn't fit neatly into these imposed classifications were often redefined or often erased. Colonial laws made this erasure an official policy. For example, the Spanish casta system meticulously grouped individuals based on their racial heritage and assigned rights and privileges according to these groups. Dark-skinned Native Americans were commonly mistaken as black or African, which stripped them of their indigenous status and posed them to the lowest tiers of society. Similar practices emerged in English colonies, with laws that deliberately blurred the lines between African-descended people and dark-skinned natives. This further obscures their distinct identities. One of the most thrilling consequences of this misclassification was the enslavement of dark-skinned Native Americans. Indigenous peoples, especially those with darker skin, were also subjected to slavery, while the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas. Colonial records show countless scenarios where dark-skinned natives were apprehended, labeled as Africans, and sold into bondage. This practice exploited their labor and also erased their cultural and historical identities. The erasure wasn't limited to individuals alone, but it extended across entire cultures. Colonizing countries destroyed native artifacts, suppressed indigenous languages, and banned spiritual practices. Dark-skinned Native Americans who were already marginalized by racial classification faced additional challenges in preserving their traditions. Their oral histories were often dismissed by European historians, lost, or even disregarded, creating a gap in the historical record that persists to this day. Religion became another strategy of suppression. Missionaries perceived indigenous beliefs as pagan and sought to replace them with Christianity. For dark-skinned natives, conversion often came with an additional layer of discrimination, as their physical appearance subjected them to the same racial prejudices that many African-descended peoples faced. Baptismal records from colonial churches frequently listed dark-skinned natives as Negroes or mulattoes, which erases their indigenous identity even further. As European settlers grew larger towards the west, the propagation of native peoples began to spread even more. Dark-skinned Native Americans were not spared from these brutal policies. The erasure of indigenous dark-skinned natives from the narrative was compounded by policies that defined native identity based on blood quantum, a concept that often excluded individuals with African ancestry from being recognized as indigenous. This narrative has remained untold. This erasure continued into the 19th and 20th centuries through assimilation policies. Boarding schools was a strategy designed to kill the Indian and save the man, targeted Native children, removing them from their families and cultures. Dark-skinned Native children experienced an additional challenge, as their appearance subjected them to harsher and more strict treatment that often resulted in their complete separation from their communities. Despite these efforts, traces of dark-skinned Native Americans persist today. Oral histories within African American and indigenous communities speak of shared ancestry, intermarriage, and cultural similarities. Yet, the colonial narrative that sought to erase these connections has persisted in influencing how history is taught and understood. Today, researchers and activists are challenging the colonial narrative as they uncover records, artifacts, and stories that make the history of dark-skinned Native Americans visible. These efforts reveal the resilience of these communities and their lasting impact on the cultural fabric of America. The colonization era sought to erase dark-skinned Native Americans, but their legacy remains steadfast. We honor their resilience but also challenge the systems of oppression that continue to influence our understanding of history by reclaiming this story. The truth, once suppressed, is now finding its voice. Throughout history, the Americas have been a melting pot of cultures, traditions, and identities. Among the most profound and often overlooked intersections is that of Native American and African American communities. This cultural fusion, which was born out of shared struggles and resilience, has shaped the identities of numerous individuals and continues to influence the social and cultural fabric of the United States. The intersection of Native and African American identities has roots in resistance and survival. During the era of slavery, thousands of enslaved Africans escaped the brutal conditions of plantations and sought sanctuary among indigenous tribes. Tribes like the Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee offered refuge and also integrated these individuals into their communities, creating a unique cultural blend. The Black Seminoles are one of the most well-known examples of this intersection. Fleeing from slavery in the southern United States, these individuals found a haven among the Seminole tribe in Florida. Over time, they adopted some aspects of Seminole culture while also preserving African traditions. This created a distinct hybrid identity. They fought against U.S. forces in the Seminole Wars together, resisting attempts to return them to slavery. However, this alliance also had its challenges. As the U.S. government sought to displace Native tribes through policies like the Indian Removal Act, many African-descended individuals who had been integrated into these tribes became vulnerable to its consequences. In some cases, treaties between tribes and the U.S. government included clauses that affected the status of black members, which also forced them into slavery or stripped them of their rights. Despite these challenges, the cultural blending of Native and African American communities continued to excel. Intermarriage became common, and many families developed traditions that drew from both heritages. This intersection can be seen in music, food, spiritual practices, and storytelling. For example, the rhythmic drumming found in both African and Native American ceremonies is a display of shared cultural elements that have endured for generations. Spirituality has been a cornerstone of the cultural intersection. African spiritual traditions have their emphasis on ancestral reverence and nature, which is a found common ground with Native American beliefs. This shared spiritual framework is often displayed in ceremonial practices that combine African and indigenous elements. These rituals not only provided a sense of community, but also served as acts of resistance against the erasure of their identities. The Reconstruction era brought new challenges and opportunities for Native and African American communities. The United States struggled with the after-effects of the Civil War. Many formerly enslaved individuals sought to rebuild their lives. In some regions, they reconnected with Native tribes, rebuilding cultural exchanges. However, systemic racism and discriminatory policies often sought to divide these communities, creating tensions that lingered into the 20th century. One of the most controversial aspects of this intersection was the Dawes Rolls, which was a federal initiative to allot land to Native Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The process required individuals to register their racial identity, often forcing those of mixed African and Native descent to choose between their roots. Many were classified as freedmen, a term used for African Americans, rather than being recognized as complete indigenous members. This classification denied them from owning land and other tribal benefits. This act perpetuates economic and social inequalities. Despite this systemic demarcation, the cultural intersection between Native and African Americans was expressed in art, literature, and music. The Harlem Renaissance, a cultural explosion of African American creativity in the early 20th century, included contributions from individuals of mixed heritage. Writers like Langston Hughes and musicians like Duke Ellington drew inspiration from both African and indigenous traditions, weaving them into the broader tapestry of the American culture. In modern times, the legacy of this intersection still endures. Powwows, which is a traditionally indigenous gathering, often feature elements that were influenced by African American culture, such as jazz-inspired rhythms and dance patterns. Similarly, Juneteenth celebrations, which commemorate the emancipation of enslaved African Americans, often acknowledge the contributions of Native allies in the fight for freedom. For many descendants, living with dual identities is a source of both pride and complexity. They honor the resilience of their ancestors who built bonds even amid intense adversity. Their stories challenge the rigid racial categories that were imposed by colonialism and offer a richer, more nuanced understanding of American history. Today, activists are endlessly working to reclaim the history and heritage of those at the intersection of Native and African American identities. They employ methods like research, storytelling, and cultural preservation. They aim to shed light on a narrative that has been overshadowed for far too long. Their efforts celebrate the unique contributions of these communities and also combat against the forces of erasure and division. The cultural intersection of Native and African American identities is a true testament to the resilience and adaptability of these communities. It is a story of survival, innovation, and unity in the face of intense challenges. For centuries, the stories of dark-skinned Native Americans and their connections to African Americans have been swept under the carpet, distorted, or completely erased. But today, an increasing movement is working to reclaim this hidden history. History, as it has been taught, is oftentimes used as a weapon of omission. Textbooks have traditionally presented Native Americans as a monolithic group and portrayed Africans as newcomers to the Americas, who arrived solely through the transatlantic slave trade. This narrow perspective overlooks the complexities of pre-Columbian societies and the centuries of interactions between Native Americans and Africans. By confronting these omissions, we can begin to paint a fuller picture of the past. Historians and archaeologists have gone through painstaking research in pursuit of reclaiming these hidden truths. They've uncovered artifacts, oral histories, and written accounts that challenge the dominant narratives. Sites like the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, where communities of escaped African slaves and displaced Native Americans lived together in resistance, are being re-examined to highlight their essence. These findings reveal a rich tapestry of shared struggles and resilience. Genetic research has also become a powerful tool in reclaiming history. Advances in DNA analysis have enabled individuals to trace their ancestry roots with unprecedented precision. For many African Americans, these tests have exposed an attachment to Native American heritage, validating oral histories that were once dismissed by mainstream historians. Genetic evidence has also revealed patterns of migration and interaction that further agree with the narrative of a deep and enduring connection between these communities. Oral history is also of equal importance. For both Native and African American communities, storytelling has been pivotal in preserving their culture. These stories are being passed down through generations. They have preserved knowledge of shared ancestry, alliances, and cultural exchanges. By watching this video, we honor the wisdom of those who came before and ensure that their experiences are not forgotten. Activists and educators are the pioneers of this movement, creating spaces for discussion and learning. Workshops and conferences dedicated to exploring the intersections of Native and African American histories are gaining traction. These events provide platforms for scholars, artists, and community members to share their findings and personal experiences. They also challenge the audience to question and rethink the narratives they've been taught over the years. Education is also another powerful tool for reclaiming history. Across the country, teachers are incorporating new materials that highlight the contributions and experiences of dark-skinned Native Americans. These lessons provide a more accurate representation of history and also empower students to see themselves reflected in the stories of the past. Museums and cultural institutions are also essential and play a crucial role. Exhibitions dedicated to the intersections of Native and African American histories began to draw attention to this often overlooked narrative. These exhibits use artifacts, photographs, and multimedia presentations to tell a story that challenges conventional wisdom and celebrates the resilience of these communities. In the digital age, social media has become a powerful tool for reclaiming history. Influencers and content creators are using blogs, YouTube videos, and podcasts to reach a wide range of audiences across the globe. With a blend of academic research and accessible storytelling, they are making this history available to a new generation. Their work is not only educational, but also inspiring, encouraging others to explore their heritage and question historical narratives. Reclaiming history also requires a systemic change. Advocates are pushing for policy reforms to ensure that school curriculums include the full scope of American history, including the contributions and experiences of dark-skinned Native Americans. These efforts are projected to dismantle the legacy of erasure and create a more inclusive educational system. For many descendants, reclaiming history is a deeply personal pursuit. They are reconnecting with ancestral traditions, learning indigenous languages, and participating in ceremonies that were once forbidden. This cultural revival is a testament to the enduring spirit of these communities and their commitment to preserving their cultural heritage. Art and literature have also become powerful mediums for reviving history. Writers, painters, and filmmakers are exploring themes of identity, resilience, and cultural intersection in their art and literary works. Not only do these creative expressions educate, but also resonate on a deeply emotional level. This promotes empathy and understanding. Community events celebrating shared heritage are bringing people together in various ways. These festivals that feature music, dance, food, and storytelling serve as reminders of the strength that comes from unity. They also provide opportunities for younger generations to learn about their roots and connect with others who share their cultural values and heritage. Revitalizing the true history of dark-skinned Native Americans and their connections to African Americans is way beyond an academic pursuit. It is an act of justice, a way of honoring the lives and legacies of those who were silenced. By uncovering these truths, we not only uncover the true narrative, but also build a foundation for a future where all voices are heard and valued. While European colonizers sought to keep both Native Americans and African slaves subjugated, they chose to emphasize heavily the differences rather than commonalities. This was part of the creation of the racialized social order. Mixed-race individuals, including those with both African and Native American heritage, were often placed in a no-man's land where they were denied the full rights and privileges of either group. Colonizers imposed racial categories that not only separated different people, but also subjugated them under a single, overarching social hierarchy. And yet, throughout this, there were still dark-skinned Native Americans who were descendants of African slaves or indigenous people, who resisted this racialization by holding on to their ancestral identities. They fought to preserve their cultural heritage, even as history tried to erase it. The systematic destruction of cultural records was also a vital tool in the suppression of these histories. As European powers expanded, so too did the effort to control knowledge itself. While some colonizers were tasked with learning about the indigenous peoples they encountered, their primary mission was to conquer. The recording of indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions was destroyed with a narrow lens, one shaped by European cultures and priorities. Indigenous people were often dehumanized in the process, as their cultures were framed as primitive, inferior, or even less worthy of preservation. Entire tribes, stories, languages, and lineages were wiped from history with little more than a few words in a ledger. The loss of these records had extreme consequences for future generations. Without written documentation, it became easy to argue that these dark-skinned Native Americans never existed in the first place or that their presence was insignificant. Even worse, as settler colonialism began to spread widely, the very act of preserving such histories began to be labeled as a public crime. By removing the evidence of these native peoples from the historical record, colonizers could justify further subjugation, and their power remained unchecked. These practices were not limited to the era of colonialism. As the United States was formed, this systemic racism continued to influence the narrative of Native Americans, especially those who were dark-skinned. Many tribes, especially in the Southeast, had long intermarried with enslaved Africans, creating a unique mix of identities. Yet, as the nation expanded, the U.S. government began to impose racial categorization that would define the lives of Native Americans for generations. The so-called one-drop rule, which held that any amount of African ancestry classified someone as black, was applied indiscriminately, even to Native Americans who had African ancestry. This erased the specific Native identities of these mixed-race individuals and relegated them to the status of black. Additionally, the infamous Indian Removal Act of the 1830s, which forcibly relocated thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. Dark-skinned Native American communities like Seminoles were affected. These tribes were completely ignored in official records, which made their existence and struggles harder to document and understand. Many dark-skinned Native Americans were pressured to assimilate or be labeled as black, further erasing their Native identity. The consequences of this erasure are still felt today as we continue to fight for a more inclusive and truthful history. If you've watched to this point, like this video, comment "True Identity" and share it with a friend. Let's spread the truth about the true history of the African descent together.